In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, you are so good to us, better than we deserve. You speak to us through all of these ancient literatures that you've given to us and you've taken care to preserve for us, and even to preserve other bodies of literature that aren't part of your inspired word, but help us to understand your word. So thank you for revealing these things in our time. And help us to understand better, a little bit better, what you have to say. Draw us closer to you and to your word. Give us greater confidence in your word, and guide us as we read it. Thank you for sending your Son at just the right time and directing all things up until his coming, so that that he came into the fullness of time. And thank you for directing history since his coming as we wait again for his return. And we pray these things under the patronage of Our Lady as we ask, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Okay. A lot of you, I'm starting to learn your names slowly, but there's so many, so I'm just going to go, and I'm not promising to remember them, but I just want to go over everyone's names again. And it's Christine, right?
Cassie.
Cassie, okay.
Baby.
I don't know why I want to
Cassandra.
Cassandra, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
And Will, and Alan.
Yes.
And
Brett.
Thank you, Brett.
Rosa.
Rosa. Have we met before, Rosa?
I think so.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Good to see you again.
Lon.
Lon.
L-O-N.
Okay, Leon. Okay,
No,
yeah.
Lon.
Lon.
Short for Alonzo.
Okay, Lon. All right.
Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi.
Okay. Naomi. Yeah. I remember Naomi. And Carol. That's right. Rick. Thank you, Rick. Lisa. And you're Lisa too. Okay, so Lisa and Lisa. Anna. Okay. Have we met before, Anna?
The very first class?
The very
Not
first
the
class.
girl,
Okay.
yes.
See? Yeah. All right. Well, good to see you all again. Thank you.
Good memory.
Get a grip. Thank you for coming back. On Tuesday night, some of you were here, and we talked a little bit about what the Essenes believed about the Messiahs. And we talked about there's actually more than one Messiah they were expecting. And it was kind of a backwards conversation, because we were talking about what the Essenes believed about the Messiahs, and I hadn't told you anything about who the Essenes were. So, and part of the reason they were expecting these sorts of Messiahs, plural, that they were, is because of their particular religious beliefs. So we're going to get into that today. I will preface this by saying there's a lot of debate about whether the scrolls were written by the Essenes and so on. And every now and then, if somebody wants to get a little notoriety, they challenge the majority opinion. Majority opinion, though, is that these scrolls were written by Essenes and that they reflect Essene belief. Okay? But just that caveat, you will find other ideas out there. And we talked about, there are people who think that these were Christians, actually, or that the Essenes were Christians, or vice versa, actually, that the Christians were like a sect of Essene. Okay. So, let's start with... Oh, I waited long enough for my... There we are. Okay, so let's start with this timeline. And if I click on it, we can get it bigger. Whoa, that's too big. Okay.
See that really good though.
Yeah.
Well, we have one point down.
Here, let's go back to this. All right, so I know it's kind of small there, but that's my... I think if I click... There, that's what I was going for. I clicked on the wrong spot. So, our story begins in really the first and second book of Maccabees, if you read those, they tell us they don't tell us exactly where the Essenes came from, but they give us the backdrop, the historical backdrop for the environment that they emerge in. And they really start in 166 BC. If you read the books of Maccabees, they talk about this sect. They're associated with the Maccabees. They're called the Hasidim. It's Hebrew for pious ones. Maybe you've heard of Hasidic Jews. It's the same word, different people.
The ones with the curve?
That's right. We call those peyot in Hebrew. Yeah. So Hasidic Judaism is a modern, actually, I say modern, it started in the 1700s. It's a modern rabbinic Jewish movement, but it's the same word, and it's kind of the same idea. These are the pious, super religious Jews. And in this very difficult time, when Antiochus Epiphanes, if you've read the books of Maccabees, you know that the big bad guy is this Syrian Greek king named Antiochus, who comes down from Syria and he invades Jerusalem and persecutes the Jews. Actually, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, so he's a Seleucid, they were already ruling over that part, but they hadn't, they let the Jews kind of do their own thing as far as their religious practices. And at this time they begin to, he is trying to evangelize all the countries that he's ruling with Greek culture. He thinks that Hellenism is the best thing. And so this causes a crisis, and if you read 1st, 2nd Maccabees, you see that he comes down there at the invitation of other Jewish people. So this tells us that a lot of the people living in Israel at that time are not very, very religious. And so most of the people probably are kind of lukewarm in their faith. And the only people who really resist Antiochus and his ideas is this special group of pious Jewry, the Hasidim. Okay? Sometime around this time, we believe, this is like one of those puzzles, those scrolls that we're trying to fit together with all those fragments. Even when we have some material in a scroll, then interpreting it is very difficult, because it doesn't tell us, it doesn't give us dates, it doesn't even a lot of times give us historical names. It uses titles like Teacher of Righteousness. Who the hell is that?
Right.
So we don't know who these people are, we just have these weird titles. And then we know that the archenemy of the Teacher of Righteousness is this dude called the Wicked Priest. They sound like, Marvel Comics characters, right? These aren't normal names for people. But we know that this Teacher of Righteousness is a very important figure. He probably founded the Essenes. There are different ideas. Some people think the Essenes were already around, and he kind of gives them a more direction. And there is some stuff in the Dead Sea Scrolls that talk about this time where they're wandering aimlessly until the Teacher of Righteousness comes to show them what they need to do. In 140 BC, this we think is when they come to Qumran. That seems to be when Qumran is founded as a religious community. Now, what's significant about this is in 140 BC, who's in charge? Is Antiochus still around? He's been dead for a long time, nearly 30 years. In fact, the Syrian Greeks who were ruling, that he was the king of, they've kind of gotten off the scene now, and the Hasmoneans, the Maccabean family, they are ruling the country. So what we have is the Essenes actually leave Jerusalem, not under pagan rule, but under Jewish rule. So this is really important for understanding the Essenes. They have problems with the people around them. One of the people that they might have had problems with was Simon Maccabeus. And those of you who were here Tuesday, you remember one of the things the Maccabees did that I told you the Essenes didn't like is the Maccabees are a priestly family. They don't come from the right priestly family, more on that in a bit. They're a priestly family, but they're also ruling as kings. And if you read Torah and you read the prophets, they don't like this idea of all of the powers in one person. They like the idea of separation of powers, really separation of church and state, if you want to. Not obviously, those are more porous than our institutions today are. But still, you have state is responsible for certain things, and the temple is responsible for certain things, and when one of those tries to boss the other one around, that's when the prophets come and say, knock it off. Yeah, you need to do your thing, you need to do your thing. The Hasmoneans, they merged these two institutions. So the priest is the king. And we think that the Essenes, and this may be in fact the wicked priest, or one of his sons or grandsons. There are a lot of possibilities, but when we hear about the wicked priest, it's probably talking about a literal high priest that the teacher of righteousness has a bone to pick with. Fast forwarding several years, 31 BC, we know there's an earthquake in Qumran, and we know that Qumran was empty. So Qumran is the city on the Dead Sea where they seem to have built basically a monastery. We know it was empty for about 4 years or so. And what's interesting is we also think they got along with with Herod the Great. And he was not, because Herod didn't like the Maccabees. He didn't like the Hasmoneans. He killed the last of them. So it may be that they actually went back to Jerusalem for a while. And we know that ancient Jerusalem, in the time of Christ even, had an Essene quarter, for instance, and they had what was called the Essene Gate. So it's possible that it was abandoned. Maybe the earthquake gave them a reason to leave, but they were slow in coming back because they were getting along with Herod the Great. I said 4 years. It was actually more like 30 years. They come back. Notice 4 BC, that is the death of Herod. That's when they come back to Qumran. So some people try to make this correlation between the Essenes and Herod. And Yigal Yadin, in fact, he would say that when you read about the Herodian sect in the New Testament, he thinks that those are Essenes. I disagree. But it's an intriguing possibility. I can't say for sure that that's not the case. I think the Herodians are more of a political description than a religious one, personally. But that's what some scholars think. And then 70 AD, remember, this is kind of ironic. The Essenes, they hate what's going on in Jerusalem. They hate what's going on in all the rest of the country. And yet, they die with everybody else in 70 AD. The Romans don't discriminate. If you're a Jew, you're a Jew in 70 AD. So they kill them all. Especially, it's possible that the Essenes may have actually attracted the Romans because they're a bunch of priests and they write a bunch of anti-Roman propaganda. So, and they're all together in one place. So it's kind of, you can see why the Romans might want to go to Qumran. Any questions? So I'm just kind of giving you an overview of history here, and I'm going to kind of pick out bits of it to go a little deeper in. Yes,
You
Al?
said that Herod died in 4 BC.
Yes.
That kind of throws off the date of the birth of Jesus, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, so there's a lot of discussion about this. Most scholars think Jesus must have been born before 4 BC. Yeah. So our calendars are off just a smidge. The whole Anno Domini calculation, that came about in the Middle Ages. So we're a long ways away from the event, and
That was
so...
the Gregorian calendar.
Oh no, I'm not even talking about that. I'm just talking about like calculating the years. So most people think, I'm trying to remember the name of the monk who gave us that calendar, and the starting with the year of Christ. Yeah, so yeah, don't let that bother you. It's not. the Bible doesn't tell us that Jesus was born in the year 0. So yeah, he was probably born in 4 BC. Yes,
Was
Lisa?
there more than one Herod's though?
Oh yes, there are a lot of Herods.
So-
So we're talking about the first of them. Yeah, Herod the Great. He, I keep forgetting that video camera's back there, so this is all being saved for posterity. I was about to talk about my family again. I don't think they look at this. You know, so I have some, there's one branch of my family.
What's the phone number?
I don't know. When Dusty gets it on YouTube, tell them all about it. So, there's one branch of my family where you've got like one kid, he's like, his name's Larry the Fourth, I think. And my dad, when I got married, said, "Don't you dare do that." Right? I did kind of almost name one of my sons after him. His name is Matan. It's in the same, it means basically the same thing as Matthew, but he's not got my same name. He's not Matt Jr. But Herod, he liked to, he named lots of, there are lots and lots of Herods who go back to Herod the Great. Yeah. But
Yeah.
yeah, like George Foreman. So you have Herod Antipas, Herod Agrippa, Herod Philip. So Herod Antipas and Herod Philip are brothers.
But is the first one that
Herod the Great, yeah.
ordered the death of him.
Yeah, and he's called the Great because he was all massive building projects in Israel. Here's a guy who was a contender with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and all those guys wooing Cleopatra.
Oh.
That kind. He was friends with those guys too. Like there, you have the fortress Antonia, just off of the temple grounds, and it was named after Mark Antony because he names it after his good friend. You know, this sort of thing. So he was a major political figure in that day and age. Sometimes we tend to think of like Palestine as this, dusty outpost that nobody wanted to go to. But Herod the Great, he's called great by not the Jewish people, but by the Romans and the Greeks, because they were impressed by what he did.
Are the ruins in the Holy Land of the
Yeah.
Alexander the Great? Are the ruins of Herod on the mountain there?
Yeah, the Herodion. Have you been there?
Yes.
Yeah. And they just found his tomb there a few years ago. Did you hear about that, Naomi? Yeah, look that up. It's impressive.
So he was the Great.
He is the Great. Yeah. Yeah, the Herodion, for instance.
Yes.
He, the guy's nuts. There's a mountain over here, and he wants to build this fortress here. So they take the top of the mountain over here and they move it over here, and he builds his fortress on top of it. And some people think that Jesus got the idea, if you have faith, like a mustard seed, you can move mountains. Well, Herod had kind of done that without faith, So it's possible. Yeah, he was crazy. Not just in a lot of ways, and the temple. He's best known for the temple project. So he refurbished the second temple that Jesus would have gone to worship in, and it still wasn't done. I mean, he started it, I think, in the it was like the 30s BC, and they're still working on it when Jesus was walking around there. And no, it wasn't the 30s BC. It was like in the 10s BC. Anyway, they're still working on it after. Because they hadn't finished it. They finished it actually, I'm going to get this wrong, but Josephus tells us it was maybe a decade before it was destroyed by the Romans. They finally finished the project. So some of you have had capital campaigns and things at your parishes. Can you imagine your house of worship working on it for 80 years or something? And then somebody comes and burns it down, right? Any other questions? Okay. So who were these crazy nuts out in the desert? And they're crazy. I cannot stress this enough. There is a tendency to romanticize the Essenes. And if we have time, I might show you a little Sunday school video that does the same thing. It's We're doing it to our kids too, and we treat them like, like they're St. Francis or something out there in the desert, and they were not St. Francis. They were nuts. I usually describe them as a doomsday cult, and I think that's a pretty fair description, because they're convinced that the end of the world is coming, and they want to be a part of it. And they're out in the desert preparing for the end of the world. I mean, this is kind of that kind of bunker mentality, really. Okay, and they're convinced that everything else in Jewish culture is absolutely wretched. So it's them against the world, including other Jews who aren't Essene. And that's their very, very binary outlook on civilization. So they have a number of concerns. One of them is to preserve this Zadokite priestly line. Now, this is something they share in common with the Sadducees. In fact, the word Sadducee comes from the Hebrew word Sadoki. Okay? It means someone from the line of Zadok. And Zadok was a priest who was put in charge of the priesthood by King Solomon. So ever since Solomon, the high priest came from this family. Remember what I was saying about the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees. They do not come from Zadok. They come from the line of Jehoiarib. Right? So they're not from the right family to be the high priest, and they just kind of took it upon themselves. And they're upset about it. Wrong person is the high priest. So that's one thing they're concerned with. They also have a unique calendar. So the Jewish people, they have a lunar calendar, mostly. And that's why, if you noticed, Easter's always in a different month, right? Every year. It's because we date Easter according to the month of Nisan, the Jewish month of Nisan, and it changes every year. It's a lunar calendar. It doesn't have, I'm trying to remember, it's like 240 some days in. I'm trying to remember. It's not 360, no, it can't be 240. But it's not 365 days in a year. I think it's maybe 340. Okay? And so that means every now and then they have to throw in an extra month. If you look at a Jewish calendar, sometimes it will have Adar 1 and Adar 2. And they just put in a whole nother month so you don't wind up celebrating Passover in December. Yeah, they try to push it off into the spring a little more. So they have this lunar calendar. And the Essenes do not like this lunar calendar one bit. They have a solar calendar, very much like ours, actually. And there is a theory that the Essenes are probably fairly traditionalist, and they may actually have the old calendar. And it's quite likely that the Jews, when they come back from Babylon, they brought back the lunar calendar that they had adopted when they lived in Babylon in 586. That's a distinct possibility. We don't know for sure, but that's a possibility. They also have their own ideas of ritual purity. We'll talk about some of these. So halakha is just a Hebrew word. It means to walk. But when someone says halakhic practice, if you read books on Judaism, you'll come across that phrase. It's talking about the way you perform the commandments. So one of the problems you have when you read the law of Moses, it's not easy to understand anyway, but sometimes it's kind of vague about how you're supposed to live out these commandments, and you can have different ways of interpreting the same commandment. And so they have some understandings of how you fulfill the commandments that are different from the other Jews. Okay? And so they preserve these particular rituals and purity laws and this calendar and all this stuff. They're preserving with their own sectarian traditions and documents. And that's where a lot of these non-biblical scrolls are coming from. They're trying to talk about how we do things, And so they write things like the community rule and the rule of the community. And we have lots of liturgical texts from them that tell you how to pray and what to pray and so on. And then all of this, though, they wouldn't do any of this except they're preparing for the end, the war that's coming at the end of time. So they're gathered, they're kind of like recruiting headquarters for this doomsday army. And they are training for war. And so they have one of their sectarian scrolls is called the War Scroll. Yeah? It's one of their longer writings. It's very, very detailed. It talks about, detailed military arrangements, who goes out first, who strikes when to fall back, and so on and so forth.
Is that not in the Isaiah?
No, this is a completely different scroll. Yeah. There's plenty of warfare in Isaiah, and they quote Isaiah in it, but it's a different text.
You're going to touch on that a little bit?
I'll do that. Actually, our next section, we'll talk a little bit about the Isaiah scroll, how they interpret the Bible. Any questions about this? Okay, so if somebody asks you, who are the Essenes, if there's nothing else you remember today, and I know I'm giving you a lot of information, but what I really want you to remember is they're apocalyptic. Okay? They're absolutely convinced they live at the end of time. What's interesting is, from a Christian standpoint, they do. They don't know why, they wouldn't understand it the way we do, but, Jesus is coming, and He's the end. There's nothing coming after Jesus. So there's a certain sense in which they're correct, but there are other kinds of apocalypticism, but we think that most of this was let's say, it still is today. You go to a Christian bookstore, not so much a Catholic bookstore, but like Mardell's. Look at all the end times books there. That is banner business for evangelical bookstores. Well, it was back then too. So when we look at intertestamental or Second Temple period literature that was written by Jews, a lot of it is apocalyptic. This seems to have been the most popular genre. And we only have 2 apocalyptic books in our Bible, but they had a bunch. And we may actually owe even our apocalyptic books, Daniel and Revelation, to the Essenes, at least to some part. One of their apocalyptic books that I think was written by Essenes is actually quoted in the book of Jude. That's the book of 1st Enoch. And I think that was an Essene book. So what does the word mean? Remember we were talking about the Hasidim? So in Aramaic, there's a word that means the same thing. It's not related, it's not from the same root, but it has the same meaning, the holy ones, Chasaya. We're not sure about this. There are different opinions, but that seems to be the best. I got this from Frank Moore Cross. And Cross, I think, is right about this. So they call themselves the holy ones. This word never shows up in the Bible. It doesn't show up in the New Testament or the Old Testament. So we don't know, again, they're never expressly mentioned in the Bible. Unlike the Sadducees and the Pharisees. So let's talk a little bit more about them being the descendants of Tzadok. So let's look up some of these texts. Does somebody, you have your Bibles?
Phone.
Last time I brought it.
Last time?
On my phone.
So I see a few of the other, that's not the right one.
You think we're going to come here and be easy?
This is a different, okay, I gotta check this. The other Bible.
Oh, that's funny.
Cassie, hard time. Okay, so we got, this has got all kinds of good stuff in it. Kabbalah and Gnostic Gospels. Oh, that's got some good, the Passion of Perpetua and Felicity, which no one ever thought was scripture. It's funny that it's in. Okay.
I just wanted your opinion on that because the Gnostic looks really pretty good and I'm going, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Ellen Pagel's coming in about 45 minutes.
Elaine Bagels, she's the authority on Gnostic scriptures. She's also probably Gnostic herself.
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
she likes it. So
She wants Princeton to be overrun.
yeah. Yeah, we can talk a little bit about that afterwards. Okay, I don't know. Oh, that one's, it's gotta be good then. Okay, so, okay, I'm trying to remember, Brett.
Yes,
Okay, Brett.
you nailed it.
So first, you have First Kings.
I have First Kings.
Okay, so this tells us about when Zadok becomes the priest for Solomon.
All right.
And you have to know, the context here is that the guy who had been the high priest, he'd gone off with Adonijah, the rival king, David's other son who tries to usurp Solomon. And so when he does that, Solomon decides he needs another high priest. So this is what's going on here. Yeah, if you agree with this,
You want me to start with 39? Or
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because this is the, so what, I'm just saying that's the context, is Adonijah has proclaimed himself king, and that's when they go to David, who's still alive, and said, I thought you said Solomon was going to be the king. And so pay attention to who anoints Solomon here.
there Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the tent and anointed Solomon. Then they blew the trumpet, and all the people said, Long lives King Solomon.
Okay. And when you go back, if you keep going down,
Okay.
well, what you see is the other priest, Abiathar, is with Adonijah. And
42,
what's up?
verse 42.
42. Yes. Yeah. Read 42.
Okay. While he was still speaking, behold, Jonathan, the son of Abiathar,
Yeah.
the priest came, and Adonijah said, Come in, for you are a worthy man, and bring good news. Jonathan answered Adonijah, No, for our Lord King David has made Solomon king.
Okay. So you see that Jonathan, the son of Abiathar, is kind of running errands for Adonijah. They picked the wrong king. And because of that, the line of Abiathar will no longer serve under Solomon. This is actually prophesied in the very beginning of the book of 1 Samuel, because Abiathar is descended from Eli. And Eli, because his sons were so rotten, a prophet tells him, your line's going to be, you're not going to have the high priesthood anymore. And this is where that happens. It goes to Zadok. Zadok also means righteous, and we see this in Ezekiel 44. So I'm going to spend a little time on the, because this is supposed to be the Old Testament portion of the day. So we gotta get in our quota of Old Testament scriptures. So I can tell Dusty I did what I was supposed to. Ezekiel 44, verse 15. And now this is not a very flattering text about the Zadokites, but it shows us that the priests are known as the sons of Zadok. You have it, Rick?
15, yeah.
Yeah.
As for the Levitical priests, the sons of Zadok, who took charge of my sanctuary when the Israelites strayed from me, they may approach me to serve me and stand before me to offer the fat and the blood, oracle of the Lord God.
Go ahead and read the next verse. That's
They may enter my sanctuary, they may approach my table to serve me and carry out my service.
Okay. And it goes on and talks about the sorts of things they'll do in the temple. But what's important here is we see that sons of Zadok, the high priest, and not just the high priest, but their entourage of priests are called the sons of Zadok. And we know that this text, the Essenes like this text very much. They use it a lot in their writings. And again, tzedek is righteousness. So a tzedok is someone who is righteous. Okay? I already said the Sadducees, they come from the same line, but the Hasmoneans, they do not. They come from the line of Yoarif. So they're not legitimate priests in the eyes of the Essenes. I should turn off my screensaver before. Okay. So what sort of things do we see the Essenes talking about? I'd already talked about there being a doomsday cult. Here's a line from the War Scroll I was talking about. This is from the very beginning, just so you can get a feel. You don't want to read much of it, probably. It gets really monotonous after a while. Has anybody read the War Scroll or tried to read any of it? Will, you might like it. No, the reason I say that is because you're a military
I
man.
was in the Marine Corps, right?
Yeah.
We studied this just before I went to Vietnam.
Really?
Of course not.
You got me.
You fell for it.
I thought it's possible because it was in the news back then. And this was, unlike some of those other texts I was talking about that were kind of kept under wraps, the War Scroll was published really early. So people knew about it. But anyway, so for the instructor, the rule of the war, the first attack of the sons of light shall be undertaken against the forces of the sons of darkness. Again, comic book talk, right? Huh? Yes, yeah, I think mythological is a good descriptor of this, yes, yeah. The army of Belial, Belial means in Hebrew, worthless. It's a name for Satan. He's the worthless one. The troops of Edom, but look who's marching with Satan here. These are actual peoples. Edom, Moab, the sons of Ammon, the Amalekites, Philistia, and the troops of the Kittim of Ashur. Now that's a really interesting one. So all these other people, these are all the neighbors of Israel. Okay? The Kittim, well, let's start with Ashur. What's Ashur? Does anybody know who Ashur is? It's okay if you don't. Think ancient Near East. We call it by another name. This is the Hebrew name. I heard. Yeah, it's Assyria. So Ashur is Assyria. Yes. But the Kittim are actually the people of Crete. So we have the Kittim of Assyria.
You know, I wonder if Tolkien studied this. This sounds
Oh,
like...
this was all published after Tolkien.
No. What I mean is his Lords of the Ring.
Yeah.
I'm seeing this as you're talking.
Yeah, there is some. Of course, I would say the Lord of the Rings is apocalyptic. So, I mean, I think you just... He hadn't read this, I don't think, but you get some of that common feeling just because he is, I would say, writing apocalyptic fiction in a way. So, Kittim of the Ashur. So he's talking about the Romans here. And the Kittim, he uses Crete. Although probably they don't even know who the Kittim are at this time, because they show up a little bit in the Old Testament, but not a lot. And they're like, there are several verses, like in Habakkuk, I think it is, where they show up and you know, kind of less than. It doesn't talk nice about them. Zechariah, they show up, and they're like, who are these Kittim? It must be the Romans. And we'll talk more about the way they interpret Scripture next month, because that plays into all of this. But just remember, for the Essenes, the whole Bible is written about themselves. Okay, and it's kind of a narcissistic way of reading the Bible as well.
That's their perception.
That's their perception. That surely everything in the Bible, the Holy Spirit was writing this for our time, because our generation is so important, because we're going to see the end. That's their kind of. It's like some of the Pentecostal preachers I've heard. Okay, it's very similar, where they're like, you know, God hid this code in this book for our days, right? And you know, if you're reading the Bible carefully, you know that's a bunch of bull hockey, because people thought that 1,000 years ago too. And people will think it again 1,000 years from now if Jesus hasn't come back, and he may well not have come back by then. But that kind of I'll call it a narcissistic reading of the Bible. It has to be about me. So we'll talk about that next time. So all these characters, they find this key team, and they don't really know who they are. And they're like, well, who do we really hate? The Romans. Oh, it's the Romans! But notice they're calling them the key team of the Ashur. And Ashur, the Assyrians, are another ancient enemy of Israel. And so the other thing about the Assyrians, they are the first real empire of the ancient Near East. So they make a nice, type for Rome, the Assyrians do. The other thing is, the Assyrians had on all their standards, Ashur, their god, looked like an eagle. So there's even some surface visual correspondence between the Roman standards and those of the Assyrians. Yep. The other thing you notice about this is where are the people in between? Who are the non-committed? It's a trick question. There's nobody. There's no gray here. You're either a child of light or you're a child of darkness. Okay? It's very, very black and white. Which is important. Again, there's more nuance in the New Testament, but it still will take this view of things is pretty much the same that you get in the New Testament. St. Paul, and we'll talk more about that again in a month as well. So a lot of the imagery, even though this is far more extreme than anything you'll find in the New Testament, a lot of the imagery is still going to be used in the New Testament. The big difference is, in the New Testament, St. Paul will say, you have been transferred from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. You remember that? You don't find any of that talk in the Dead Sea Scrolls because they're fatalistic. You were born that way and you don't have a choice in the matter. They are like 5-point Calvinists, okay? To be anachronistic, really, really anachronistic. Any questions? So they're apocalyptic and they're very, very militaristic in their apocalypticism. I'm not going to read all this. What I want to show you, so this is from another book that we actually had before we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Ethiopian Bible. The Ethiopian Bible is a weird critter. It's the biggest canon of any church. They have like 80-some books. And that's in the narrow canon, because they have the broader canon. We're not really sure how many books go in that one. It's a weird thing. And one of the books in the in the Ethiopian Bible is called Jubilees. And Jubilees comes out and endorses this solar calendar. So we knew there was this ancient Jewish writing that talked about how you shouldn't have a lunar calendar because that's the calendar of the feasts of the Gentiles, right? You don't want to do what the Gentiles do. So you have to have the solar calendar. And we're like, what? Jews believe this? Because Jewish people don't follow a solar calendar today. And when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, we realized we probably had found, because we didn't know the Essenes had a solar calendar before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And we also found many, many copies of Jubilees in the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. Not full copies, unfortunately, but fragments. Pretty good size fragments. Jubilees is a weird book. You can find it online, read the whole thing if you want to. I think you'll find it very boring, actually. Parts of it are very interesting. Most of it's very boring. It's a retelling of Genesis, basically. In Jubilees, the author or authors of Jubilees, they were bothered by the fact that the law is given to Moses on Mount Sinai hundreds of years after Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the patriarchs, and all these. I mean, they come out of Egypt 400 years after being in bondage, and they were. The question was, are we really supposed to believe that the patriarchs didn't have Torah? So they rewrote Genesis to show that even the patriarchs had Torah. In fact, even the angels have Torah. In fact, the angels are circumcised. I don't know how you circumcise an angel, but okay. Praxis. So we have this kind of worldview, this apocalyptic worldview. It's all going to burn. We have to be ready, all this stuff. And that means we have to live in a certain way, according to certain rules. And the rules that we have, I've talked about the ritual purity, and they have these liturgical traditions, these special prayers. And then they have a very strictly ordered community life. And then they also have scribes. They are a dedicated bunch that they're just writing. They're writing new books, and they're copying old books. Unlike anything we found in the ancient world. So ritual purity, we talked a little bit about some of these. So one of the things they do, remember, they're preparing for this eschatological war. And one of the other places that we see military camps, where Israel, all of Israel is a military camp, is in the wilderness wanderings. And so what they do is they take all those laws that were written about the military camps and they apply them to their own life in Qumran. Okay? What that means, though, this has some practical consequences, because when you are in the military camp, for instance, you cannot do number 2 inside the camp. You have to take a shovel and you have to go a certain walk. And the Deuteronomy chapter 23 tells us that you have to go to the place outside the camp. And the Essenes say, well, that's 3,000 cubits. They measure it out. So you can't pop a squat until you're 3,000 cubits outside of the camp. The problem is, on the Sabbath, you can only walk 1,000 cubits, which is half of what Orthodox Jews today can walk, by the way. It's half of what the Pharisees can walk. So they're very kind of strict. You can only walk 1,000 cubits. So that means, what happens on Sabbath?
Hold it.
You gotta hold it. Be careful what you eat on Friday. Right? Interesting. The other thing, and I know this is stuff, a lot of times we think, Westerners, Christians, there's this whole big Messianic Gentile movement. Have you seen this? Torah Christians, this sort of thing. There's this romanticism about Judaism. And when you actually read Jewish stuff, you realize they're very concerned with very earthy things. So I apologize, and this might seem a little bit crude, but these are the texts. I tell that to my students all the time. They're a little offended that we're reading about some of the things we read in the Bible. I'm like, these are the texts. It's kind of the same with the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'll give you, even in prayer, the first prayer that a Pharisee, an Orthodox Jew will pray is a blessing thanking God for all the holes in his body. So they don't have any problem, like we got spiritual things and we have earthy things that we don't talk about. They'll pray about those earthy things. And you get some of this in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So one of those earthy things has to do with sexual intercourse. And in the camp, anytime you have a seminal emission, you are unclean. Okay? Now, I've talked before here a year or so ago about uncleanness. That doesn't mean you've sinned. They're not saying that sexual contact is a sin. They're saying that it's inappropriate because something significant has happened to go on with your daily life as though nothing happened. It's actually saying that sexuality is very important and holy. Okay? So it's a way of kind of putting a boundary around it. So they say we still have the laws of the camp. So in in the laws of the camp, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, if you have a seminal emission, what you have to do? You have to go outside of the camp for a day. And then you have to immerse yourself to be clean, and then you can come back into the camp. Alright? You're unclean. Don't pollute the camp. Because the Lord has his tent in the middle of the camp. That's where the tabernacle is. Well, for the Essenes, Jerusalem is where the tabernacle is. It is the camp. So what does this mean if somebody lives in Jerusalem and they're an Essene? Think about the practical consequences for married couples. So they just say, you cannot live in Jerusalem if you're married. Now think about it. This is the capital city. There are more Jews living in Jerusalem than anywhere else at this time. And they're saying, you can't be married here. Don't pollute the holy city. So, I mean, these guys are kind of nuts, is what I'm saying. You can see why this Essenism didn't take off, right? It wasn't very popular because it was only for certain people, this wasn't for everybody. So we see, this is from one document that talks about this. The Temple Scroll actually says married people aren't allowed to live in Jerusalem. But even here it says, if a man has intercourse with his wife, he may not enter any part of the temple city where I shall make my name to dwell for 3 days. So, I mean, obviously, married couples can't live in Jerusalem. But even if you don't live in Jerusalem, if you're going into the temple city, into Jerusalem, you have to abstain for 3 days. Now, how do you purify yourself after you've had a seminal emission or any other thing? You go into a mikveh that's looking down. So you have these steps. And probably you would go down the steps and you would baptize yourself like this. Put your head all the way under the water. No, you don't have a Baptist preacher sitting down there singing Just As I Am, one after the other. You have to baptize yourself. That's how they do it. And then they would come up the other side.
They go clothed?
Oh, good question. No.
No.
But generally speaking, the Jews would not wear clothing. The Essenes probably did, because they were very, very modest. But a very simple white, there's some debate about this, but we think the Essenes actually wore linen robes.
Because the water, it doesn't go up the steps, it's down there.
That's right. Yeah, so they have to go all the way down into it. So like Pharisees, this is why the ancient church, by the way, had deaconesses. Because you got baptized in the nude in the church as well. So you had to have women ministers to baptize women. Adult women. You understand? So, but the Essenes, they probably actually wore a linen robe to do this. Or even today, Orthodox Jews, you're expected to go in completely naked. Yep. Good question. Any questions about ritual purity?
So the Hasidic Jews are descendants of the Essene.
No.
Where do they come from?
They come from the Pharisees. Yeah. And I don't know if I'll get to it today. Essenes do not like Pharisees. And there are Pharisees living at this time too. And they do not get along one bit. Yeah. Personally, I think Jesus was a Pharisee. And I have reasons for thinking that. I don't think the Essenes probably liked Jesus. And Jesus loved them, but I don't think Jesus liked Essenism either. He singles it out, I think, for critique in the Sermon on the Mount. Any other questions? Yes.
I thought I read, or maybe you said or mentioned that perhaps John the Baptist was a Essene.
Yeah. So that's right. So we have ritual purity is a big deal for the Essenes. It's a big deal for Pharisees too. but it was a bigger deal for the Essenes. One of the reasons we think this, Qumran is littered with these things. They're all over the place, and they're big, hold a lot of water. Now, some people think they weren't all mikvahs. Some people think a lot of them must have been cisterns for water. And they are in the desert. They need a lot of water. It's possible, but their writings talk about immersion as well. So we have John the Baptist. Yeah, he does something different with it than they do, though, because he lets anybody come to be immersed. The Essenes, to join the Essenes, you have to go through a trial period for a couple years, and John the Baptist doesn't do that. And John the Baptist also says this is a baptism. It has a ritual purity significance that's primarily for repentance of sin. So sin has polluted us, and we need to be washed of sin. In the Essenes, they talk a little bit about this, but they don't connect it with baptism, like John does. So he takes, I think it's quite probable that he grew up with the Essenes, that maybe even Elizabeth and Zechariah were Essenes. They're priests, we know. But that he goes and does something different with this, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. That's the other problem, is what we know about the Essenes really comes from the documents found in this one place. And that's something we have to remember too, is we're not sure. There might have been other versions of Essenism outside of Qumran. We don't know.
Isn't that a lot of the thinking right now by scholars? There's more.
Yes. We think that they might have been like a break-off group, actually. Yep. That's quite possible. So community life. Good. We got time to talk about this because this is important. One of the things about the Essenes is they had two orders. So remember, you cannot be married and live in Jerusalem. And you can see how, for the priests who want to serve in Jerusalem, that's going to be a problem. They're going to go back to Jerusalem and be in the temple. So that means most of the priests are not married. And that gives us some precedent for what we do with our own priesthood. This is significant because before we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, although Josephus talked, we kind of ignored Josephus, and we kind of ignored some of these other sources until we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, because we thought he was just making it up. And you can't trust it, Josephus. And we find out he seems to be telling the truth on this. So the Orthodox Pharisaic Jews, the idea that you would not get married is unimaginable. Everyone gets married. Why would you not get married? So that's caused a problem. Is like, where did Christians get this idea that we see Jesus espousing and the Apostle Paul saying that for someone who has the vocation, it's actually better not to get married? That doesn't sound like a Pharisaic rabbi. You understand? Well, we do find this among the Essenes. And we find that you could be married and be an Essene, but you're not going to be in that inner circle. I always think of third order Franciscans when I talk about this. So you can be Franciscan and be married, but you're going to be a third order Franciscan, right? Some of the other things that we find, so Qumran really does seem to be a monastery. I don't think it's wrong to call it that. And it makes a lot of Jewish scholars upset when they hear that. We talked a little bit on Tuesday about cultural appropriation. They feel like we came to that site and we just started, a bunch of these Christian, even a lot of them were monks. And they start looking at the evidence and like, hey, it's a monastery. And the poor Jews are looking at her like, you want everything, you know? You took our Old Testament, now you're taking the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we have to be sensitive to that, but I do think there's a lot of evidence that this is very much like a Jewish monastery. In fact, this is a little bit of a tangent, but we know that in around Alexandria, in the deserts around Alexandria, there was another group that was very similar to the Essenes, that Philo of Alexandria calls the Therapeutae. And they lived in the exact same places that the Desert Fathers start up. And I wonder if there's not even a genetic relationship, that the Jews had this lifestyle out in the desert, and then early Christians kind of just took it up from them. It kind of makes sense to me. And it's interesting, you go to Qumran, and one of the things that they'll tell you is you're looking at all these caves where all the Essenes probably lived. They didn't live in the city. We don't find any dwellings in the ruins of Qumran. We think they lived in the caves. But one of the problems is desert fathers also lived in the caves around there. So it's hard to tell who left what behind, because they might have been Christians later. So there's an interesting, there's some overlap here. A lot of the same activities.
Did they
Yes,
have
now-
any furniture in the caves?
Actually, like Cave 4, we think a lot of the scrolls, that's the treasure trove of the caves. More of the scrolls, more scrolls are found in Cave 4 than any other cave. And there's a lot of debris from like rotten wood that they were lying in, and we think they had like probably bookshelves or something that they were sitting in. Yeah, we don't know for sure. It's all so they probably did have furniture, but it's all rotted since then. One of the things that's interesting is they have a hierarchical structure, and it's quite possible, I would say even likely, that even though the early church would not like the theology of the Essenes, some of the organizational structure of the Essenes probably appealed to them. And so we see that that they, in their community rule, they describe being led by, there are two names used, a mevaker or a pakid. And every community would have a mevaker who would be ruling over that community. And it's almost identical to the way the episkopos is used in the New Testament, or the bishop. Okay, so this seems to be correspondence between this mevaker guy and the bishop. And then we have 3 priests who are under the mevaker, and then you have the 12 laymen. Isn't that interesting? 12. Now, obviously 12 is significant for the Jews because of the 12 patriarchs, but it kind of shows they kind of see themselves, I think, in the same way Jesus does, as this restoration of Israel. So anyway, I think that's significant. One of the things that we see is they share everything in common. They are religious communists. And again, you think about the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 4, they share everything in common. And it could be that the early church is even adopting some of the community activity from the Essenes. And we know that probably a lot of Essenes are becoming Christians at that time as well, and influencing certain ideas. Like I said, before you became an Essene, you had to go through this 2-year period of trial. This would have been excruciating. I don't know how they got any recruits, because you had to live in the desert without any food. You just like scratch along like Jesus in the wilderness, eating whatever grew on a bush, whatever, drinking whatever you found coming in a riverbed. They weren't allowed to eat with the Essenes until after this 2-year period. And yet we know they got recruits. Josephus says he almost became an Essene. He also says that the guy who was teaching him wore bark for clothing. So,
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, here's a frightening thought, they're like apocalyptic hippies, right? in some ways, you know? Oh, I wasn't going to talk. Yeah, I thought about skipping this, but this is really beautiful. They have this idea of 24/7 perpetual adoration of Torah, encountering God in Torah. So in one of their documents, it says that there shall not depart from a place where there are 10 men, that's called in Rabbinic Judaism a minyan, a quorum, 10 men, a man interpreting the Torah day and night perpetually, each man relieving his neighbor in turn. And the many will keep watch together for a third of each night of the year to read in the book and to interpret the ordinance and to bless together. So there's one night of the year that they all come together to stay up as a community, at least a third of the night. So somebody's reading Torah in the community all year, every night. And I think that there's something beautiful about that. It reminds me very much of our Adoration Chapel.
Yeah.
And then we talked about the Messianic banquet on Tuesday. I'll just mention that they have this idea, they're rehearsing for when the Messiah comes, where they have this meal where they eat bread and wine, which is interesting. And it's quite possible Jesus chooses the material for the Last Supper from this tradition of a sacrifice. And some, like Hike Al-Yadin, I know I keep mentioning this guy, I think he's right. He says a lot of interesting things. And one of the things Hike Al-Yadin says is because they've rejected the sacrifices in Jerusalem, but they're Jewish, they still need sacrifices. So they've replaced the sacrifices in Jerusalem with the sacrifice of Melchizedek, which is an offering of bread and wine. And we see them coming together and eating this in rehearsal for the Messianic banquet when the Messiahs come. And so in this document in particular, 1QSA, that talks about the Messianic banquet, we see the high priest is preeminent. He, the anointed priest, he's preeminent over the Davidic Messiah. So he's a Messiah as well. Sorry. So I talked about this Tuesday, but I'll just go over this because most of you are not. The Essenes believed that there would not be one Messiah coming, but three. They're in the three messianic offices of prophet, priest, and king, that all three had to come. And because they are priestly, that they're going to be the big kahuna. And the Davidic Messiah, he's going to have to take orders from the priest. So that does seem to be the case. Any questions about this? Yes,
I was just wondering if it would be possible, and I don't know, maybe this is already on there, but it'd be nice to have a printout of your PowerPoint, so you
Okay, you know what? I'll do my best to remember
in the
Dusty can
statement.
email it to you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
that'd be great.
Yeah, there's no reason you can't see this. This is publicly available on Prezi. Yeah. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you.
We've seen all that.
Yeah. And I can do, I've got some others on this, so you can look at all of these. Yeah. Good.
Thank you.
Yeah, because I know this is a lot to take
I've
in.
never even heard that term SC until you mentioned it last.
Oh, really? Okay. So that, I'm guessing that you're not the only one. Okay. See, I live in this weird world where I'm consumed with these kind of texts. Day and night, I don't think about anything else. And I forget that there are people who don't know this stuff, so it's good. Yeah, thank you for reminding me. Yeah. Yes, Carol?
I had a thought, but I've heard, like in the last couple of years, that there's been some speculation that Mary and Joseph could possibly have been from the Essenes. What do you think about
I think that's hogwash.
Okay, well, I was just wondering, because I'm like,
Yeah.
well, some of the, I don't know,
I don't have proof that that's not the case. I think it's very unlikely because the main reason is, it seems to me Jesus was raised to be a Pharisee. Jesus, to me, I think this is almost proof. Joseph and Mary, after 40 days after Jesus' birth, what do they do with him?
The temple.
They take him to the temple to present him to the Lord. I don't think an Essene would do that.
Okay.
The Essenes regarded the temple of Herod, as invalid. It had been polluted by these dirty Sadducees. Well, first the Hasmoneans and then the Sadducees. It was not. So one of the interesting things that, I know I'm going over time here, but this I think is significant. One of the interesting things is we see the Essenes, they say, that temple God's done with. Well, where is the temple? They say, we are the temple, about themselves. And that's another one of those ideas that the early church said, I'll take that.
Kind of, yeah.
So it's because we have the same temple theology, that now the temple is not made with stones carved by human hands, but that we are living stones that make up the temple of God's presence. But Joseph and Mary, they weren't there yet. They're like, and Jesus didn't have any qualms about worshiping in the temple. The main problem for the early church was not that the temple was invalid. It was, well, it wasn't around anymore after 70.
Yeah.
But before that, the Christians often weren't allowed to participate in temple worship. And so if they're not allowed to go to the temple and your religious life revolves around temple worship, what are you going to do? So they come to the realization from the Holy Spirit that, well, we are. And they might have gotten that idea from the Essenes. But I would say from the start, at the very beginning at least, the Christian orientation towards the temple is far more positive than the Essenes is. So even though they kind of maybe borrow from them, I want to stress it's still different.
Okay.
Now, so I'll just say that again. You will hear all kinds of crazy ideas because there's so much we don't know. There's enough gaps that you want to fill them in with maybes, and usually these maybes are not quite
I
right.
think we wanted this time period and this history that is so important to be like, well, just Google that. You should be able to just like, put
right.
it all down. We want something that's very airtight.
It's getting closer and closer to where you can do that, which is good and bad. The other thing, I know it's totally good, but remember what I was saying about how the Dead Sea community is kind of narcissistic when they read the Bible, and we're kind of narcissistic when we think about the end times and stuff. We're also narcissistic about things like the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovering, we're like, how is it that Jesus couldn't be associated with these? Well, it's not all about Christians, right? So we have something to learn from them, but it's okay if Jesus and the early church don't show up in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not all about us, even though history is about Jesus, ultimately. But that doesn't mean every little detail has to be explicitly connected to him. And sometimes that's hard for Christians to fathom, I think.